We have continued our education. Alexander Musienko, I remind you that our entire large broadcast today is dedicated to the liberation of Bucha. Today we are marking the 3rd anniversary since the city endured Russian occupation. Actually, Mr. Alexander, while discussing the current situation at the front and the overall confrontation between Russia and Ukraine, we wanted to recall that specific period. Did you, as a military analyst, have the feeling at that time that the fate of the entire war was being decided in the Kiev region?
Undoubtedly, that was exactly the case, because it must be understood that during such a large-scale war, the capital will always be the focus of attention, primarily, for the enemy. And therefore, of course, what to protect. Defending Kiev was one of the priority and fundamental tasks. Again, understanding that every settlement is truly important, but we must realize that the front is very large, and it was necessary to act by choosing what the current priority is. Why? Because you understand perfectly well, imagine if, God forbid, the Russians entered Kiev and it was essentially about the occupation of the Ukrainian capital. This is an extremely demoralizing factor.
So, Mr. Alexander, not from a political point of view, but from a military perspective, in any war, what does the capture of a capital mean?
This is primarily demoralization, of course, for the military, because you understand a brilliant advance, the enemy's rapid, imagine, the enemy's rapid advance, the enemy enters the capital, that's it. And we do not know what the subsequent processes could be. Obviously, the government and state authority in other cities, somewhere closer to the west of our country, accordingly, what does this mean? This affects the condition of the units, it affects readiness and society in the same way. And the army, especially back then, it wasn't fighting without relying on society. The territorial defense units of the armed forces of Ukraine, tens of thousands of volunteers who joined, they are all members of society. And it was important to preserve. From a military point of view, well, you understand perfectly without revealing any details, but a lot of things are tight, including command points, process organization, and much more. Of course, in every war, different scenarios are considered, both bad and very bad, and the fact that combat operations will have to be conducted from different conditions, from different command points, and so on. But defending Kiev was extremely important. And at that time, the decisive role of a large number of people, specifically volunteers, territorial defense forces, who then dispersed into different units and are now fighting in completely different directions. Whether someone is from Kiev or not, it no longer matters. But back then, this will to resist, I can say that these stories that you showed, I remember, and recall all of it. No, it's on the screens. Similarly, there's a very interesting documentary film, Shields of Kiev, which shows a lot about what actually happened. How the territorial defense forces mined the bridges where the enemy was supposed to cross, how they conducted their work, how they held back, how they stopped them. Alongside other units, units from other brigades of the armed forces of Ukraine, the National Guard, special units of the main intelligence directorate, and others who contributed a lot. And of course, this will to resist the proper organization of defense, it yielded results. And ultimately the fact that the enemy, you remember the nature of the actions of the Russian troops, it was clearly traceable. The goal that was set was to encircle the Ukrainian capital. That is, they aimed to surround Kiev. And it was absolutely clear that they were approaching from the northern part. Then they moved to the west. Towards Makariv as well, the goal was to effectively cut off connections with the west of our country. And they considered the scenario of how they would approach from the east when they were not allowed to reach Brovary. But the scenario was also from the east. The south remained to block logistical connections. They couldn't solve this task, it was happening. And so they were moving towards the full implementation of these tasks. But they didn't allow this to happen.
You see, Mr. Alexander, you've taken us retrospectively back to the beginning of 2022. And I remember, if we go from local to global, we all watched with such anticipation every month to see what aid package the Americans were sending us. Back then, remember, there were packages worth 300 million. We talked about this on the air, and it wasn't even monthly. These aid packages were arriving twice a month even. The amounts reached up to $500 million. And back then, we couldn't even imagine that in 2025, we would be sitting here discussing a different administration of the United States of America. Today, there's another statement from Donald Trump regarding the agreement on rare earth metals. Supposedly, Ukraine does not want to sign it, and If Ukraine does not sign it, it demands some guarantees of joining NATO. If Ukraine does not sign this agreement, it will supposedly face big problems. This is not a full quote. We are summarizing what Donald Trump said today. And, you know, when you hear this from the president of the USA, once again, it gives the impression that this agreement about rare earth metals is not about peace negotiations. It's about some whim of Trump or a whim of Washington. At this stage, how do you perceive this agreement?
I will tell you that it's not just a whim. This is a matter of national security for the USA. The fact is, for example, just last month, the leading analytical publication, American Military Review, this is one of the top American military publications. They clearly wrote and gave an analytical report that if the US identifies China as its main adversary, likely, and we see that this is the case in both the previous administration and the current one, this is an ongoing issue, they need a strong defense industrial complex. What is needed for a strong defense industrial complex? Including minerals, metals, and natural resources that are used for the production of various types of weaponry. And now, the USA is engaged in actively searching for these around the world. Hence, the issue of Greenland has arisen. There are also large deposits there. It's not just about security, so why did the energy minister visit the island? We understand, as part of the delegation, that is, they are searching as much as possible around the world because US military analytical services indicate that they may not be viable for a large-scale global conflict. Their defense industrial complex will not meet the Army's needs to carry out the tasks that will arise. And that's why they have now started searching. There is a political component, I understand it's excellent, there are conditions, there is everything. But is it purely a whim? I wouldn't say so.
Oksandra, but the issue isn't that the Americans want Ukrainian minerals. Ukraine, in principle, is not against it either. And this was our proposal from the beginning in the peace plan that Zelensky presented. The survey, the rhetoric of these negotiations, the question of the terms of this agreement. Because Trump has already said that Zelensky wants to withdraw from the agreement. Accordingly, what started circulating in our media and what was indirectly confirmed by our Deputy Prime Minister. Sviridenko about that agreement, that bill, which states that Ukraine practically has no rights there. A voice, 3-2 in the board of directors. And well, practically it gives away its mineral resources to the Americans. At the same time, having no security guarantees, obviously Zelensky wants NATO membership in exchange for this, about which Trump says it will never happen.
You know the order. First, regarding the president of Ukraine, nowhere in any way did he mention that he is generally withdrawing, that Ukraine is withdrawing from the negotiation process, and we are not considering it. There was a statement that the project was submitted. Of course, we
discussing this publicly, especially not to destabilize the situation.
So I can say that the points will be considered, obviously, and Ukrainian proposals will certainly be made. But this is a matter of the negotiation process. It's not a matter of turning around or slamming the door and leaving. No, this is a matter of the negotiation process. It's normal. Regarding the issue of security guarantees. You know, it's not always the case that everything is needed. And it's not always appropriate to include everything in a single document. You know, there was such a structure as the Marshall Plan in Europe post-war, after World War II. The configuration seems exclusively economic, to boost the economy of European countries and what to do. Not to allow the communists from the Soviet Union to influence the communist parties in Europe so that there wouldn't be a polarized Europe, one under the influence of the USSR, Moscow. But what happened with the Marshall Plan? In 1949, the North Atlantic Alliance was created and the corresponding treaty was signed. That is, security still came into play. Military bases began to appear in Italy, then this started to happen in Germany, followed by the Cold War, and the entire military infrastructure was built in Europe. All of this came with the money. And I can say that it seems to me that in our case, everything might come together in this way as well. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything will be immediately established. We also need to understand what the interest would be. Imagine a large corporation that wants to invest money if they realize it's not protected. Yes, it doesn't work. And it won't work no matter what the agreement is or what its terms are. Even if it includes security guarantees. And moreover, the second point, we also need to understand that we really want to see it in practice. We have been burned by the Budapest Memorandum. Therefore, for us, it's not even just about the agreement. The agreement is important, and security guarantees are important. For us, it is important to see in practice how this will be implemented. because any agreements, if they are not implemented in practice, if we, so to speak, do not see increasing the provision of aid, more air defense systems, and possibly even the presence of American troops on Ukrainian territory in the future, of course, it will be clear that then, any agreement on rare earth metals will also not work. And who will be working on all this on the ground?
Mr. Alexander, you have already mentioned air defense, aid, and the protection of the funds that could potentially come to Ukraine. Here we see statistics from the air defense forces, from the Ukrainian air forces about what is happening in birds. Ukrainian air defense has destroyed over 4,000 aerial targets. If we look at the ratio, there are only 36 missiles, it seems, and the rest are all drones. There are 800 of an unidentified type, 800 drones, which are reconnaissance drones, and a total of soon 328. These are Shaheds. In this context, we see how Russian air attacks are changing with fewer missiles being used. Remember the months when there could be 3 massive Russian missile attacks per month with 120, 100 missiles and so on. Now, per month, only 36 missiles. And here we are talking about air defense infrastructure. To fight against missiles, we ordered Patriots, we requested IRIS-T. These are the systems that protect our skies from missiles. And now, when the ratio of aerial targets changes, when there are many more Shaheds than missiles flying towards us, how does our air defense infrastructure look against Shaheds, and how should it ideally look in the future?
I can say that from the side of the territorial defense forces of the armed forces, mobile fire groups are operating across the entire territory of Ukraine and are also shooting down Shaheds almost daily. There is almost no day without Shaheds being shot down. Air Force units are also operating. These are the ones who shoot down using anti-aircraft missile systems and aviation. Army aviation and ground forces are also involved, they too are engaged in deploying their helicopters, not only to counteract, and there are electronic warfare systems. This is what is lost in location. It is marked. That is, in fact, what did not reach its target and landed somewhere. But what is the change in the situation today? In that, unfortunately, we must admit that the enemy is quite seriously experimenting. They are studying, including the actions of our air defense systems. This is natural. They conduct reconnaissance, try to understand and work on the technical improvement of their drones. In addition to releasing a significant number of decoys, so-called, which fly without a warhead, but they are noticeable, and you have to spend ammunition on them as well. That's true. But now, you see that they are experimenting with altitudes. The drones fly either high or lower. The second episode, which is also important, is that indeed, if drones gain higher altitude, they can be shot down. They can be shot down by anti-aircraft systems. The question is the availability and quantity of the corresponding missile stockpiles, so that every night you can fire 20, 30, you understand? That's a large number.
Isn't that costly?
It is, of course, costly, among other things, and it takes time to produce. That's why different methods are used. Now you see that drones are gaining altitude. After that, as they approach targets, usually large cities, they rapidly descend. And accordingly, in fact, for mobile fire groups, it becomes noticeable somewhat later, and so on. But despite this, you see the statistics are very high. That is, Ukraine is also adapting. They change something, we change too. They try to improve something, we also improve, so that they do not achieve their goals. And it will continue to be so. What is important now, when there are many warnings about a possible large-scale Russian offensive? By the end of spring, the beginning of summer, or another period, this cannot be ruled out, although it must be understood that such an army, something enormous, they will not gather several 100,000, and there will be nothing that we do not already see. There will be some activation on some section of the front, yes, perhaps some tactical successes somewhere, but not on an operational or strategic scale. The greatest threats to us right now are actually from the air. Because you see, Russia has mastered a very cheap technology. Why are there fewer missiles? The question, the answer is very simple. It's cheaper and faster to produce. Plus, it's much easier to make changes to the technical equipment of a drone than to do this with missiles. Every time. It's faster, it's cheaper, and it's more reliable, as the enemy believes. Therefore, this terror that they are now conducting with drones is the greatest threat that remains for us, particularly for the civilian population and overall.
Mr. Oksandra, could you clarify when you mentioned the trajectory that the Shaheeds fly, that they initially fly very high and then descend before reaching the cities? This is also the answer to the question many have. Why is a drone that flies such a long distance, for example, why Mobeto to Kiev, shot down right over the city itself? Why, they say, can't it be shot down somewhere along the way, not in such a densely populated area? Mr. Alexander, please be brief. We have a minute.
You know, I think many people probably have a short memory, but I want to remind you that in 2022 and in 2023 they also reached. And there were no changes in this either. The issue is that indeed they change altitudes, trajectory, flight, and there are many of them. Sometimes they fly precisely to a single target. When there are very many, we understand perfectly that yes, they are shot down, yes, they are destroyed, but some reach and are shot down directly on approach. Because the conditions are such that otherwise, if it were possible to shoot them down earlier, if it were possible, to cover every 100 meters with mobile fire groups, it would be easier. But here too, we need to understand the realities.
Thank you, Alexander Musienko, military expert, military officer of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, was our guest. Thank you.